We are really excited here at the Historical Society to have Alex and Susan here. And Alex is going to be running the conversation, the questions between Eric and Susan as well. They're both going to contribute a little bit to our discussion tonight, and we will have an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you think of something, keep it in mind, and we will provide that opportunity at the close. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves throughout their interview. And yeah, let's welcome them to Los Alamos.
Okay, thank you. Is this level okay? Can everybody hear me? I think as a first course, before I show this little tidbit, I just want to say that so Oppenheimer was a major figure in my life from the time that I first can remember, when my father started researching this book, to adulthood in my 30s. It was a very, very long journey. And I thought, as a matter of proving our authenticity for this moment, that I would show you this little clip of our family trip to New Mexico. It was my father, Marty Sherwin's first research trip as part of the Oppenheimer project. So there's no sound on it,
Right.
but we'll do a little ad-lib narration. Check your mic.
I think I'm fine. Can you hear me? No. Or no? Hold on.
Keep it really close.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we can go ahead. So there you go, little context, little Al Sherwin. This is familiar territory. There's Marty posing in the road, setting up. Now, adobe bricks. They took us to make adobe bricks at the house of a physicist who did not work on the Manhattan Project. There's pile driving your son as a form of adobe brick making. But if anybody, this would have been a good trivia question. This person right there with the shovel, and I'm going to freeze on him in a second, is Rossi Lomanitz, who was a protege of Oppenheimer's at Berkeley. He did not work on the Manhattan Project, but Marty went out to interview him. He lived in New Mexico. So we made adobe bricks to help him build his house, or put an addition on his house, actually. And then
I want to stop a second to say that Rossi Lomanitz was an interesting figure for Oppenheimer. He was one of the students, very, very active in lots of left-wing activities, and had been really during the McCarthy period had been blacklisted and could not get a job. Hence, living in New Mexico on a rural place.
All right, I'm going to cut you off, sorry, because the movie doesn't stop.
Fast. Go ahead.
So the most important part of the trip was to interview Peter Oppenheimer. And we went on a horseback ride to Perro Caliente. And famously, one of the horses escaped, and one of my early memories was seeing my father gallop across the field, which I didn't know he could do. A kid from Brooklyn, he knew how to gallop on a horse. That was not captured. The cinematographer here, by the way, is my sister, Andrea, the late Andrea Sherwin, who was incredible. She was 13 years old, and she was documenting all this. Yeah, of course. Now you can go.
Okay, sorry. Many of you might know this, of course, that Peter, well, a complicated family, of course, with Oppenheimer, but Peter was very reclusive, and the only way he could get he would agree to have Marty talk to him was if he would come up to the ranch and help him mend his fences. And so we dropped him off. We all went on horseback. We left Marty with his horse at Peter's. And they talked, and it was the only time that he could ever get Peter on. Some of it a little bit on tape, but mostly off tape. So it was a rocky start in terms of just doing research. I mean, it was a difficult interview, but an important moment, because you always feel you're doing a biography. You want to obviously do as much of the family as you can.
So I wanted to show this to show just how long the ride has been, and as a matter of handing it off for the importance of this event, just how grateful we are to Eric for bringing this new chapter to the story of, you know, our ride with Oppenheimer, and bringing the story of Oppenheimer as a book, as printed material to young readers, which I think Marty would have been so happy about. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Can I say just one more thing?
Eventually, Eric's going to talk.
about Eric, about just the symmetry of the moment, how much Marty would be so happy that we're here, we're back in Los Alamos, but also that Eric was a student, a PhD student at American University, and through a combination of circumstances, Marty sat on his committee for his PhD. So the fact that then Eric surfaced as the potential writer for this version was especially meaningful for us and for our family. Yeah.
Thank you. Vice versa. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the faith and the trust that you put in me to adapt this work. 25 years of Marty's life in the archives, reading all of the secondary sources and trying to get your head around something so complex, and then understanding the gaps, what needed to be written about Oppenheimer, which was a lot that needed to be written about Oppenheimer, and where do you go for that information, and then the analysis of all of that information, and putting all of those pieces together. It's for those of you who are historians in the audience, you know how complicated that. It's really it's really an art form, a very, very meticulous art form. And Marty was one of the best historians that I ever met, and he was also an incredible person. When he was on my dissertation committee, there were a couple of other members of my committee who were pretty stern. And they were, I came into my defense and they were staring at me and there was no smile on their face at all. And in walked Marty, and Marty had this big smile on his face. And he said, "Look, I've read through this thing over and over again. We would not have this defense if we weren't 130% confident that you were going to ace this. And you are going to do great, and don't worry about anything." And it was that energy that he brought into my defense that really allowed me to, knock it out of the park. And that was the kind of guy he was. So during that process of writing my dissertation, Marty acquainted me with this incredible, with the results of all of that, incredible work. The book American Prometheus that he co-wrote with Kai Bird, and that was published in 2006, and that won the Pulitzer Prize, and that ultimately was adapted into Christopher Nolan's 2023 blockbuster film Oppenheimer. So that's the legacy that Marty has left, and it is incredibly profound.
So Eric, you answered my first question.
Sorry, I'm too fast.
No, that's okay. I thought it was going to be fun to contextualize both your life and your career with the Oppenheimer journey and ask you, tell me about the first time you read American Prometheus. So you gave part of that answer, but tell us about that.
Yeah, so in 2012, I had been immersed in a lot of different literature pertaining to nuclear weapons. And I had gone to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I had traveled with Hiroshima survivors and had listened to their stories. And I had read arguments in favor of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and against dropping the bombs on Hiroshima, and of course Nagasaki. And I was putting together my battery of knowledge on these issues. But the one thing that I guess I was missing was a humanized account of how the bomb was built, and of what what were the circumstances, what were the human circumstances that gave birth to, to the most horrific and destructive weapon ever known to man. Marty and Kai, this book humanized that process in a way that no other book that I had read to that point did. And it made me, really contemplate the ethics and the morals of the whole thing, and understand that, the weapon was built by, not a machine of people, not a project, but by human beings who had a whole range of attitudes and philosophies and misgivings and motivations. It wasn't a simple story, and so it was that complexity that this book, really injected into my scholarship. So 2012 was the first time that I read it, and I would say that, maybe I'll fast forward then to the idea to adapt the book for young readers, or should I wait?
Predicting my question.
Okay.
But you used
I'll
the
wait.
word complexity, which is where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, and I actually don't know the full answer to this. How did you come to be a writer for young readers? And part two, how do you approach such a complex story and make it one that's appropriate for young readers?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a teacher by trade. When I graduated American University as an undergrad, I went on and got a master's in education, and I taught high school history for 4 years. And I understood that you're trying to teach a class of 30 kids, maybe 200 years of history in a school year. And for those of you who are teachers in the audience, you know how difficult it is to get through all of that material. It ended up being a very, very difficult project. And so the question was, well, how can I make this material interesting for kids who are just, maybe most of them just aren't going to be naturally interested. And so I realized that you needed to tell stories. You had to start with the stories. And when you start with the stories, and when you really get inside of somebody's mind, and you explain the motivations, and you look at how maybe, at arguments and at conflicts in history, that is a sort of a natural motivator. And so I guess that, my adapting books for young readers sort of came out of my mission as an educator. There are so many books that are up on the dusty shelves of our libraries, and those books contain crucial knowledge and crucial accounts of, people who were involved in projects that forever changed the ways that we live. But they're not accessible. And so how do you make them accessible? You have to make them as interesting as possible. And you've got to tell the stories that, at the beginning, you've got to sort of set up an inductive approach where you hook kids into the excitement and the wonder and the conflict and the complexity of history. And then once you do, then you paint the context around it. So adapting books for young readers is really, I sort of went in that direction because I wanted to give kids access to narratives that they would not otherwise have access to. The second part of your question, again, was, what was the second question there? That was the second. Okay, got it.
You did the second.
Good.
And I wanted to take, we're going to get into your study of the character, but I wanted to go over to you. This is going to be a challenge. I want you to tell a short version of the story of how Marty decided to write a biography of Oppenheimer. It's a big challenge.
That is a challenge. They can't be too short, but I'll just be quickly that the important part, as I look back, was that when Marty was looking for a dissertation topic and thought about writing about the atomic bomb, there were many people, we were at UCLA at the time, who were trying to say, don't write about that, there are too many books about it. But there was one of his mentors who said, if you think that the subject needs more scrutiny, that there's more information, that you have something new to bring to it, then you should do it. So he took on for his dissertation the making of the atomic bomb, which was really his dissertation and his first book. The odd story that then led to Oppenheimer was really that he had been asked to, we were at Princeton at the time, and Marty was asked to write a short, very, very short biography. At that time, there was a popular, I can't remember, it's Arthur Schlesinger, one of the very big historians that were doing a series on many, many prominent people, and he was asked about it, and the person at Knopf was guiding Marty through had guided Marty through his first book, and was thinking, he was thinking about a second. He said, don't waste your time on a short version of a book about Oppenheimer. He deserves a long biography. And even though it's a very long time ago, and Marty said, oh, well, I'm too young to do that. And the fact is that he did sign on, and it was a very, very long process. And I was telling Tom, as we walk through the hallways here, and I see people that I remember him interviewing, because as you can imagine, now we're talking about 70s, 80s, many of these people were still around to be interviewed, and all of those interviews are wonderfully lodged at the Library of Congress. So there's a lot to say, but that's how we got there.
I think thinking about these hallways is a good transition, because something that we agreed that that'd be great to talk about is we're here in Los Alamos, and for everyone that's read American Prometheus, the place is a real character in the story. And I wanted to ask Eric, now you're here. Tell us about that.
Well, I guess in the immediate room here in Fuller Lodge, I guess I had envisioned this room to be a lot bigger. It's a lot more intimate than I sort of envisioned. And it's, coming here to Los Alamos was a little bit disorienting, because I was envisioning the place as Oppenheimer, came upon it, which was, it was a boys' school, and there was very little infrastructure, and I guess there was a dirt road coming up here, but maybe not much else. And he came up here on horseback, coming into town and seeing all of the built infrastructure and the city that has arisen out of this project. I almost couldn't believe that pulling into the parking lot that I was at Fuller Lodge. So it took me a little while to sort of get my bearings. I was just, that was my first impression. This place made such a profound impact. And when I say this place, I'm talking about New Mexico. Made such a profound impact on Oppenheimer. It really, it shaped his views toward the ways that people should live, toward the rhythms of nature and the rhythms of life. He coming from the Upper West Side, where things are pretty frenetic, coming out here really gave him the opportunity to reflect and to philosophize and to go deep and try to figure out, what he wanted with his life as best he could at that point, when he was 17 or 18 years old, which is when he first came here. I think maybe I'll read a little bit from the adaptation about what it was like when Robert first got here. And this is adapted, of course. The language from the original is just incredibly vivid and extremely well written. And I tried to stay true to the original as best as I could. Robert spent the long winter of 1921 to 1922 cooped up in the New York apartment. He was a terrible patient. He acted boorishly, locking himself in his room and brushing aside his mother's efforts to help ease his discomfort. By spring, Julius decided that Robert was well enough. He had had an illness prior, but he was well enough to get him out of the house. He called Robert's old teacher, Herbert Smith, from the Ethical Culture School, and urged him to take Robert with him on a trip to the Southwest that summer. Smith had made a similar trip with another student the previous year. Perhaps a Western adventure would help toughen Robert up. Smith agreed to take him. The student and his teacher started out in the South. They gradually made their way across the mesas of New Mexico to Albuquerque. There, they stayed with the family of Robert's only friend, Francis Ferguson, who had attended the Ethical Culture School on scholarship. The two boys had become close during their senior year, but it was this visit that would cement a lifelong friendship. Francis introduced Robert to another Albuquerque boy their age, Paul Horgan. Paul's first impressions of Robert were striking. He combined incredibly good wit and gaiety and high spirits. He had this lovely social quality that permitted him to enter into the moment very strongly, wherever it was and whenever it was. Like Robert and Francis, Paul was very bright. All three were headed for Harvard in the fall. From Albuquerque, Smith led Robert and Paul and Francis 25 miles northeast of Santa Fe to a dude ranch called Los Pinos. The ranch was run by 28-year-old Catherine Chavez Page. Catherine was a charming and headstrong young woman. Robert found himself instantly attracted to her. But any hopes he may have had for a romance with her were dashed. She had just married Winthrop Page, a man old enough to be her father. The ranch boasted a spectacular view of the Pecos River as it twisted north toward the snow-capped Sangre de Cristos. This was to be Robert's stomping ground for the summer. That summer, I'm going to fast forward a minute. That summer at Los Pinos, Robert evolved from a shy and emotionally vulnerable young boy into a much more self-confident young man, one who seemed more in control of his own destiny. Catherine motivated him and emboldened him to take risks. She approved of him the way he was. For the first time in his life, Herbert Smith recalled, Robert found himself loved, admired, and sought after. One day, Robert, Catherine, and a few others grabbed horses and rode south from the village of Frijoles. They ascended the Pajarito Plateau, rising to a height of over 10,000 feet. From there, they traversed the Valle Grande. And sorry, my pronunciations may not jive with yours. You'll have to correct me. A canyon inside the Jemez Caldera, a bowl-shaped volcanic crater 12 miles wide. Turning northeast, they rode 4 miles and came upon another canyon, which took its Spanish name from the cottonwood trees that bordered a stream trickling through the valley. The canyon's name was Los Alamos. Patches of grazing meadows broke up dense pine and juniper forests. Atop a 2-mile-long mesa, bounded on both the north and south by steep canyons, stood a Spartan boys' school, the Los Alamos Ranch School. The school enrolled only 25 boys, most of them the sons of wealthy Detroit car manufacturers. Throughout the year, they wore shorts and slept on unheated porches. Each boy was responsible for tending a horse. Frequently, they packed up their horses with food and clothing and rode off into the nearby Jemez Mountains. It was a completely different kind of education from what Robert was used to at the Ethical Culture School in New York City. Robert immediately connected with the rugged landscape. His experience there changed his life. It opened his personality and gave him a much wider perspective on the beauty of the earth. He later wrote a friend, "My two great loves are physics and New Mexico. It's a pity they can't be combined." Robert didn't know it then, but that very same New Mexico plateau would shortly become ground zero for a project that would impact hundreds of thousands of people and forever change the course of human history. And he would be the one to lead it. So that's just, there are other descriptive sections of both Los Alamos and New Mexico more broadly, but that's just one example of
I could just
it.
add,
Yeah.
Eric, that listening to that reminded that when we would get, as Eric was writing, Kybert and I were getting, and you too, really, getting the manuscript along the way, and we were just amazed how fast you were writing, how beautifully you were writing, and how wonderfully you absorbed the story. And again, this isn't an abridgment of American Prometheus, it's an adaptation, and it's very much your own, and it's beautiful.
Thank you.
I want to follow up on that because I love the way you said that it wasn't an abridgment. We assumed when there was going to be a YA version that this was just an ed. That it would be like, oh, this, get rid of these 90 pages, get rid of these 40 pages, trim a few sentences. But Eric explained to us very, very eloquently about the need for scaffolding for the young reader, for going back and explaining things, for taking different routes into a story, and he did that beautifully. I want to go back to the passage you read, because there's something happening in there that's such an important part of the story, which is we see this precocious, socially awkward person bloom. And and the physical, this physical environment is a big part of that. And I want to ask you about his character and bringing that character to a young reader. Was there anything were any particular challenges or surprises in that process of like, how do I explain who this guy is and his quirks and all this? Because the character is so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, and I don't think that I with 330 pages, it's very difficult to even scratch the surface of the complexity of Oppenheimer's personality. He, early in his life, he was always brilliant. His parents knew that he was brilliant. And they did whatever they could do. I mean, they were well off, and they were very supportive of him. And they bought him a sailboat because they understood that he had a love for the nautical. They brought him to Europe on multiple occasions. He met his grandfather Benjamin in Germany, and while he was in Germany on one trip, Benjamin gave him a rock collection. And it was that rock collection that really ignited his passion for, it wasn't the rocks themselves, but it was the light that emanated from the crystals that was, that was what moved him. But he was always socially awkward, and, there was one example of he was at summer camp, and the exact circumstances are sort of escaping me. I think that, oh, that's right. Some of the boys were talking about sex. And I think Robert had notified his parents of this. And his parents were not very happy about that, the fact that those conversations were taking place at the summer camp. So they went up and they met with the the director of the camp. And word got out that Robert's parents had gone out and raised this issue. And the boys, they exacted retribution on him. And they stripped him naked and tarred and feathered him and locked him in the camp ice house overnight. And this was not an isolated act of bullying. Robert was bullied at many different times throughout his young life. I think that it was episodes like that both brought out his inner toughness, because Robert was a very, very tough person when he needed to be, but also, were very destructive for his self-confidence. And I think that there are a lot of kids, maybe they're not bullied in that kind of an extreme way, but some are. But I think that teenagers are going through a lot. And I felt like it was important for younger readers to understand that Robert was not always the father of the atomic bomb. He wasn't always this this larger than life figure that that was given credit for with Leslie Groves for building this thing so quickly, but that he was a child, and that he had the same kind of problems and the same kind of insecurities and the same kind of social, issues that maybe a lot of kids are dealing with. That's one way I could answer the question.
Yeah.
But I think that those personality quirks stuck with him throughout his life. He always had the knack for saying exactly the wrong thing when he was under pressure. An example of that, if we were to fast forward to his meeting with Harry Truman after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when I think he asked Truman, when do you think the Soviet Union is going to get their bomb? And Truman turns to him and says, Truman turns to him and says, well, when do you think, they're going to get it? And he says, well, I'm asking you. I mean, you're the president of the United States. And Truman says, never. And, Robert didn't know what to say. He was flummoxed because he knew that in very short order, the Soviets would have their own bomb. To him, this was just, and to many of the scientists, this was just the next progression. Truman says never. He couldn't believe that the president was so naive in his mind. And, he says, well, Mr. President, he gets flustered. He says, I feel like I have blood on my hands with regard to, any kind of support for the hydrogen bomb. And at that point, Truman, there are different discussions about what actually happened, but it sounds like Truman pulled out his handkerchief from his pocket and gave it to him and said, well, basically you can wipe that blood off your hands. Let me deal with all of that stuff. So, he was very awkward in situations where he was under pressure.
One thing I want to get into before we open it up for questions is, I think you did such a skillful job navigating this complicated person, this complicated story, and delivering it to young readers. And so what I did, we don't have a huge, pool of kids that have read it at this point, but I did have a precocious son of a friend. And my daughter was actually an early reader who gave Eric some feedback that she was very proud of. But I called up and interviewed this friend of mine, and the reason I just thought of it was because I asked him, well, is there anything you want me to ask the author and that you sort of didn't get enough of out of the book? And he said, the kid, this is a 12-year-old kid, he said, I wanted to know more about Jean Tatlock.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, tell us about that process, because his romantic life was a very important part of the story. So how do you approach that for young readers?
Well, obviously with Jean Tatlock, there are a lot of heavy issues. If I were to tell the whole story that was told in American Prometheus by your dad and Kai, we would have to deal with issues of suicide, or issues of we don't exactly, how did Jean Tatlock die? Did she die by suicide? Maybe she was murdered. I mean, that's another possibility. Those weren't issues that I really felt like spending a lot of time on as I'm writing for young readers, because I would really have needed to write a lot of context. It would have been another book, and it's just not appropriate. Especially, when I'm writing a book about Oppenheimer, it would have completely derailed the narrative, of his life. It became a little bit too thorny. I couldn't, but I needed to deal with Jean Tatlock because, as you say, Jean was one of the most influential people in Robert's life. And so I decided to explain how they met, in which circumstances they met. They met in Berkeley. They met in the home of Mary Ellen Washburn, John and Mary Ellen Washburn, who were prominent progressive activists and members of the local Communist Party branch. And Jean was also a member of the local Communist Party branch, although she didn't identify herself as a communist. In fact, nothing really pigeonholed Jean Tatlock. She was her own woman. but she was a free spirit, and she was incredibly smart, and she was a ray of light in his life. She turned him on to all of these issues of social inequality that he became, that he became a champion for during the 1930s. She told him about the longshoremen in San Francisco who were striking for better wages and the importance of standing up for them. She really educated him about the impact of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, which swept millions of people from the Midwest out to California in search of a better life. She had this social awareness. She wrote for the local, for the Western Worker, I believe, the local Communist Party magazine. And, Robert was just absolutely loved that. And it was that story that I felt was important to tell. So I told that story, and I set her up as that kind of an influence in his life, the person who reactivated the social justice imperative that had been encoded in him at the Ethical Culture School on the Upper West Side. That was Jean Tatlock's role.
So I have some more questions that we can mix in, but I think it'd be a good time, if it's okay with you, to open it up to the floor.
Sure.
And that way, great.
Great, yeah, I have a microphone, and I apologize for some of the sound dropping out. I'm guessing it's Edward Teller upset we're not talking about him.
Yes, I'm ready to talk about Edward Teller. While I was working at the laboratory, the director had me meet with Teller every summer because he wanted to know what was going on with the politics in Congress, and that was my specialty. I ran government relations with that. But I always wondered if there was any further insight into that whole relationship. Oppenheimer had to move Teller out of the way. Not very easy to do. Any further kind of thoughts about that relationship?
He had to move Teller out of the way. Well, I think that the relationship between Teller and Oppenheimer obviously went south when Oppenheimer started speaking out against the building of the hydrogen bomb. To be quite honest with you, I'm not an expert in the relationship between Oppenheimer and Teller, except to say that, I think that Oppenheimer was trying at different stages within first within the establishment to push back against what Teller, ultimately wanted to do. I'm sorry, hang on one second.
Is that you?
I can't tell if it's me. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I do think that Oppenheimer, wanted to marginalize, Edward Teller's, increasing enthusiasm for the development of the hydrogen bomb. Yeah.
And the opposite is true. Teller wanted to really obviously move Oppenheimer off the record or off the power so that he could go ahead, as most of you know, and as he did convince people. I would just tell very quickly an anecdote because Teller wanted people to think that he liked Oppenheimer, and he did not like something that Marty had written. It was actually even in his earlier book, and this is a long time ago. Again, we were in Princeton, and Edward Teller called Marty and said, I can't do the accent, which I'm sorry, I can't do in a frightening voice. Where did you get this piece of information that says I did not like Oppenheimer? I said this, and Marty happily remembered exactly where he got it, and he said, Dr. Teller, he said, this is where I got it, and I will send you the reference. But he was, so to tell it, just to say, he took the trouble to call Marty to say that he questioned what he got, but Marty verified what he did get. But I think it tells you something about the complicated story between them, because some of you know better than I do probably, they admired each other's brains and talent, I'm sure, but disagreed politically on what were the next steps regarding weapons.
It's on. How about now? It really was on. It was.
That's weird.
Hopefully you can hear me.
I got you.
Okay. So I wanted to have a little bit more background on kind of what inspired you to do a youth novel, right, about a complex figure at a complex time to write youth books when so many of those are under so much scrutiny right now.
Well, what I wanted to do, and what really drew me to Oppenheimer, was, this question of what happens to a human being when he is caught up in, when he enters a project for what he sees as the greater good, right? Which in that case was an acute Nazi threat. That he had finally found his calling, and he was finally recognized for his brilliance, and for not just his brilliance, but for his personality, and how really perfect he would be to lead a project like this. His social skills. He was awkward, but he was also really gracious and really kind, and he considered all manner of different perspectives. And he was able to not just consider those perspectives, but to anticipate those perspectives. A person like that who really had been schooled to want to do good in the world, but then ends up in a situation where the world is changing at such an epic clip, and where circumstances are moving and political sands are shifting, and then now all of a sudden the Nazis have abandoned their bomb project. And then of course, so what do you do then, right? That question was really, motivating me. Well, what do you do then? Oppenheimer, we know that Oppenheimer had a lot of pushback at that point. Well, now that the Nazis have abandoned their bomb project, why do we need to continue developing ours? We're building a weapon of mass destruction. We don't know how horrific this thing could be. Maybe we need to cut the project at this point. Oppenheimer, of course, answered that, no, we need to push forward. We need to test it, because ultimately the world needs to see the kind of destructive power that we're bringing to bear. It was a complicated process for him, and and then of course again in May of 1945, when Germany was defeated, the question was, well, what are we going to do with it now? Of course there were so many who were vociferously opposed to dropping it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer, of course, made a calculation that was going to end the war more quickly, because that is what he was told, and that's what he believed. Kids are going to be in situations in their lives that are really, really complex in any career that they undertake. And, I think it's important for kids to know how to operate within systems. For a productive democracy, there needs to be robust discourse, and there needs to be complicated thought, and there needs to be, questioning, and there needs to be sort of, ethical thought processes. And kids, I think, should learn about these complexities from a very early age, so they don't just go into something without thinking things through. I think that's really, that's why I thought that Oppenheimer was really important to write about. I also thought that, as I mentioned before, I wanted kids to understand that people or that's not the right word, but people who have reached the pinnacle of triumph, as the title, says, they're still just people. And they are, they're just like a lot of other people. The way history is taught in our country is deficient. Kids are made to memorize a whole bunch of dates and names and regurgitate them on a test. And I think that a better way to teach history would actually be to share Oppenheimer's story and show how Oppenheimer, this is not just a biography, but what this is a story of America and the world in the 20th century through the eyes of a human being. We need to humanize history. That's what we really need to do if we are going to, if we're going to get kids to fully understand it. So, yeah.
I think another way to answer that question is, I think any historian who writes, a big fat book would love to have a YA book written of their book, but that's just not a reality in publishing. Enter Christopher Nolan, right? And suddenly this could happen. Like you could make accessible now because of the popularity of the film, and a film is great, but a film does not replace a young person reading, 300-400 pages. And so the film was this opportunity where, like, wow, we get in the door here. We can get a young reader's version because of the popularity of the film. So, that'd be another.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Oh, here we go. Yes.
Hi. First of all, I want to just gush for a minute because I read the book and I love it. I think it is such an essential version of this story for young readers. Everything about it just screams it needs to be in the hands of young people to learn this essential history. So, first of all, thank you for writing this book and adapting a cornerstone of Manhattan Project history.
Thank you.
I am curious, as a little bit a teaching background, this to me screams to be in the classroom, it screams to be part of an active lesson plan, and I'm curious if you were to teach this book in the classroom, or if you were to advise a teacher how to teach this book in the classroom, how would you kind of create that lesson plan? Would there be any like accompanying texts, or how would you picture that lesson going?
It's a good question. It's a complicated question because there are so many different angles that we could approach it from. But I would say that in the book, what I did, I thought that through. What are the footholds that we should seize upon for asking pedagogical questions. And I outlined them. So you've read the book, so you saw the different sections in gray. And I think I would start with, if I were to write lesson plans, I would start the lesson plans with some of these questions and some of these sections in the book. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. Here's one. This was at Trinity. As Robert and his fellow officers lay there almost 20 years later, anyway, don't worry about the 20 years. There's a lot of context to that. On land sacred to many prior generations of fellow humans, the weight of the world was on all of them. Hundreds of thousands of years of human knowledge and almost a half-century of advances in quantum mechanics were about to yield the most powerful bomb in history. What might the future be like after it was used? So to create a lesson plan where you're asking kids to think about, the implications of that all of this progress that had been made, this question was going through Robert's mind. We're going to now build a bomb out of this? What are some of the other things that we might be able to do with this knowledge? That would be one, sort of ancillary question. Prior generations of fellow human beings, there are just so many, human implications. That's one example. Another example, would be, let's see. Okay, so here's another one. If we talk about pedagogy, we could ask kids to critique their current educational environment through this one. Robert's experience at Los Alamos convinced him that scientists couldn't just research and experiment in a vacuum. They needed to think about how their inventions might impact people both positively and negatively. Science and the humanities had to be studied together. If scientists read philosophy, they might think harder about the whys and what-ifs of what they were doing. If they read psychology, they might better understand how others could use their inventions to control or manipulate others. If they read history, they might understand how their discoveries could change the nature of war and peace. With quantum mechanics exploding so rapidly, scientists had to keep asking the hard questions about what their work might create and what it might destroy. And it was that philosophy that really, when he got to the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, that really guided, his development of that institute. And then get kids to think about the ways that they're being taught, right? Their subjects are so stovepiped, science and social studies and English and mathematics. Ask them, how can we change that? And, to create a more project-based learning environment that might resonate better with you and be more productive for both you and your community. So, I would engage students in these, some of these like really in-depth ethical questions and get them to think a little bit out of the box about their current realities.
Well, if somebody else wants to think of another question, I want to throw it at you because I'm proud of this. This was from my daughter, who said to me pretty casually the other day, she said, well, if Oppenheimer was Prometheus, who were the eagles eating his liver? So I'm throwing that to you.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit on that one would be Louis Strauss, right? Because Louis Strauss was out to get him from, ever since he really found out about Oppenheimer. But, I think it was, as time went on, it was the people who wanted to marginalize Oppenheimer, not just Strauss, but the others, for daring to share his, ethical and moral quandaries outside of the government, right? Specifically with regard to the development of the hydrogen bomb, and to this idea that we might be heading toward a situation where we can't control nuclear proliferation, and it might bring on the end of the world. Oppenheimer, even went so far as to say that, at some point, it might get to a point where the world might curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. And those were some pretty provocative words coming from the father of the atomic bomb, from the person who, was arguably the most instrumental in developing this. The people who didn't want him speaking out, I think, were those eagles, who were, and there were a lot of them. McCarthyism was a time of a great chill, and it wasn't just, when Oppenheimer was brought into the AEC hearing, and then ultimately stripped of his security clearance. It sent a message to scientists across the entire country that, what Oppenheimer did, the things that Oppenheimer were saying were a long bridge too far. So I think that, it was the people who didn't really want, this kind of discourse. I think, we could extend it and say that it was fear itself, a culture of fear that really, was one of those, maybe one of the biggest eagles. So that would be my first impression there.
I was just going to say, I hope you all understand how important this meeting has been tonight. You will not hear these real words anywhere else in the world except here tonight. So I really want to thank Susan, I want to thank Alex, I want to thank Eric, and I want to thank Rachel, Alex's wife back here, for sharing our time, and of course Alex, and I want to thank Nathan and Rachel, my staff, and Kristen for putting all of this together, and I really hope that you all pick up Eric's book, think about it, because a lot of you in this room knew me when I was very little. And now I'm up here with a microphone. How weird is that? So, but what's really interesting to me, we have the Oppenheimer house that we have to interpret and bring into our museum. We need to decide what stories are we going to tell. Now, of course, as a museum, we want to keep it very factual and with no editorials or no opinions on either side. The problem is that we've got a whole generation, multi-generations, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, a lot of these younger kids that are coming of age that we need to remind we never want to have a nuclear conflict again. But as a museum, I have to present the facts without opinions. So if any of you have sort of guidelines on how I'm going to do that, please let me know. But I want to thank again Eric, thank you so much. Alex, Susan, thank you guys. We had a wonderful conversation over at the Blue Window for dinner. Please, Melissa at the Blue Window prepared quite a few wonderful little desserts back there. Shout out to Jean at Pack 8 for always supporting us and working with the videography and everything. And again, my staff here at the Los Alamos Historical Society, both Alex and Susan will be around to talk to them. Please be gentle. They've been traveling quite a lot, so be gentle with them. Eric will be signing some books here in the back, so please stay around for a while, eat some more things, and I think Rachel might have something to say. Oh, we have some trivia things. Right. Oh yeah, you guys have to,
Let's thank our speakers. So we do have a book signing following, so America will be out there and they'll be around to chat. So I'm going to let them kind of move as Nathan gives us the result.
I was actually going to ask you a question, but Todd cut me off.
Sure.
So, having read both American Prometheus and Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb, obviously you're taking a very complex story and making it simple. So there are editorial choices involved. I was wondering if I missed it earlier, I'm sorry. Can you kind of walk us through kind of what was kind of your guiding principles or some of the overarching ideas in your mind as you're taking a large story, a large and complex story, making it accessible for the young adult audience, obviously having to leave stuff out, add stuff in, amplify other things, and just kind of walk through your thought process?
I mean, it's a complicated question, and I don't even know if I can answer it fully. But I'll say that I wanted to retain the splendor of the original book. I would say that was my main priority. I wanted to be true to the original narrative, to its trajectory, and to its outcome. And so that's why I didn't do any flashbacks or anything like that. I maintained the chronology. The relationships between Oppenheimer and the people in his life were so meticulously detailed in the book that I had to, in some cases, I had to make extrapolations, right? And I had to make conclusions from some of these more complicated descriptions of the relationships. And then of course those conclusions that I came to, then I had to figure out how to write in language that would be appropriate for young readers. I also wanted to maintain the vividness, and vividness, is that a word? I think it is. The vividness and the action, right? Like one of the most captivating parts of American Prometheus is the description of the Trinity test itself. And I felt like in that case I needed to be I needed to use a lot of that material verbatim because I wasn't going to be able to do it better myself. The descriptions were intensely artful and just brilliant. So it was those kinds of sections that I kept. Another example would be the security hearing. The security hearing was so incredibly chronicled. And it was really, to read through that section it's a lot to read. I wanted to make sure that the most important exchanges were preserved, and preserved exactly, because if I had strayed at all from even one word, then that would have sort of compromised the historical integrity of the account. And so I needed to go back and double and triple check that I had recorded the quotes, verbatim. And thankfully I didn't have to go back and fact check, because I didn't have to worry about that at all. That was not that had been taken care of for me. So I had to retain the sections that were really incredibly interesting. I had to take out superfluous material that I felt would, about some of these more complicated relationships, and then make conclusions that, I don't know, I had to do a lot of boiling down. And the reason you're hearing, it's a very difficult process to describe. I don't think that I can even describe it to myself. Thank you.